So as I said, my name is Stephen, and I'm grateful to be your neighbor. As I mentioned earlier, already in the few weeks that I've been your neighbor, I and my family have been shown such graciousness and hospitality between the broken wrist and other curveballs. This congregation has been truly stellar in helping us out and showing us just how important hospitality is to this congregation. And we can't wait to reciprocate that and to grow together as disciples of a Savior who compels us to make hospitality our muse. But let's be honest with one another, that's not always easy or natural, especially when God calls us to be compassionate and merciful to, that person, that neighbor, that coworker, that immigrant or refugee, that person who looks different or loves different or sounds different than you. The scribes and the Pharisees, we'll learn in a minute, put their own spin on it in today's gospel lesson, asking Jesus what should be done with women like this. Perhaps you've considered another person to be that person, or perhaps you yourself know what it's like to be labeled that person. The difficult and blessed charge of the gospel is that we are called to show neighborliness and hospitality even and especially to that person. It doesn't mean we always have to agree with them. It doesn't mean that we don't hold one another accountable. It also doesn't mean that we compromise on our commitment to justice and mercy, but it does mean that we must never lose sight of the beloved child of God that resides within those with whom we disagree and disapprove. And so today's story from John's Gospel, I think, gives us a template for how to approach neighborliness in such incredibly divisive times. As it turns out, to my knowledge, this is the first time I've ever preached on this rather familiar passage, and perhaps that's because it does not show up in the Revised Common Lectionary, and that tends to be the source of my preaching text. But the lectionary text for this Sunday didn't spark much for me, and I wanted to begin our time together with the intentionality that it deserves for this particular time and particular place as we begin our discipleship journey together. And so today's passage was the first one that popped into my mind when I wanted to think about how to hopefully set the tone for the next chapter of this great congregation. And so in my reading of the text, you will notice that there will be two very intentional pauses in the reading of this text. I have not had a medical event. Those are intentional. So let us listen again for what God is saying to God's church in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. Early in the morning, Jesus returned to the temple, and all the people gathered around him, and he sat down and taught them. The legal experts and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and placing her in the center of the group, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery, and in the law, Moses commanded us to stone women like this. What do you say?" They said this to test him because they wanted a reason to bring an accusation against him. And Jesus bent down and wrote on the ground with his finger. They continued to question him, so he stood up and replied, "Whoever hasn't sinned should throw the first stone." Bending down again, he wrote on the ground. And those who heard him went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. Finally, only Jesus and the woman were left in the middle of the crowd. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Is there no one to condemn you?" She said, "No one, sir." Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, don't sin anymore. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. For those of y'all on social media, have you ever come across, or perhaps written one yourself, a post that you know is going to be a complete and utter dumpster fire? You know what I'm talking about. Somebody posts something political on either side of the spectrum, and you get out your lawn chair, you grab your popcorn, and you wait for the comment section to blow up. The name calling begins. Each comment tends to escalate in tone, getting more and more defensive and combative. And then come out the passive-aggressive gifs and the snarky comebacks. And then both sides retreat into their respective corners, and then the comments start to be typed in all caps. That's when you know that you have reached the point of no return, and that there is no way this comment thread is ending in a happy place. And frankly, it was probably doomed from the start. I want us to think of today's passage as a situation that held the potential to devolve into just such a dumpster fire. But the way Jesus responds gives us a much different outcome. So together, let's pay attention, close attention, to this text and what it is demanding of us and what God is saying to God's church. The scribes and Pharisees, let's admit it, are itching for a fight. They know it, Jesus knows it, and the crowd that has amassed to watch the drama unfold knows it too. These church leaders have brought before Jesus a woman who, they say, was caught in the act of adultery. Now, right from the beginning, there are a couple red flags that need to be brought to light. First of all, as far as we know, there are no official witnesses to the actual act of adultery. The scribes and the Pharisees say that she was caught, but give no evidence of any official witnesses. And according to the Mosaic law, 2 witnesses were required for such an accusation to be taken seriously. Okay? The second red flag is this. Even if there were 2 people who said they witnessed the event, we all know that the testimony of a woman in those days was not admissible in court. A woman, and it happened all the time, a woman could easily be the victim of assault and then accused of adultery in an effort to get the man off the hook, knowing that she could not defend herself in court. Which brings us to the third red flag. Where's the dude? We all know that it takes 2 to tango. And if this woman was supposedly caught in the act, it would be safe to assume that the identity of the guy is not a mystery, and according to the Mosaic law, the man was also to be punished for participating in such sinful activity. So from the get-go, Jesus has the wisdom to know that this isn't really about the woman. He knows that she's being used as a pawn to justify the scribes and the Pharisees' self-righteousness. They are deliberately trying to draw Jesus into that comment thread. They're trying to draw Jesus into that conflict. And unfortunately, this woman is the collateral damage. It's a lose-lose situation for Jesus. If his argument is that the woman should go free, then he is flaunting the law. If he argues that she should be stoned to death, he's compromising his message of love and mercy and compassion. And Jesus' response to this warmongering effort to draw him into that lose-lose situation, to doodle in the sand. Now, there have been thousands of folks like me and perhaps like you who over the years have been very curious about what it was that Jesus was drawing in the sand. And many people have come up with their own hypotheses to exactly what it was. Some have speculated that Jesus was maybe writing some verse from Jeremiah 17 that talks about writing in the sand before those who have turned away from God. Some have noted that it was the practice of Roman judges to write down their verdicts before announcing them out loud, and maybe Jesus is satirically doing the same himself. We don't know. The bottom line is that you and I have no idea what Jesus wrote in the sand, and any guess to what he did can be nothing more than mere speculation. But that does not mean that we don't have anything to learn from the act itself. Now bear with me here a second. I'm going to do what Jesus did, and I want you all to pay very close attention. What do you hear? That's exactly right. You hear nothing. Absolutely nothing. By doodling in the sand, Jesus pushes the pause button and invokes silence in a particularly tense and escalating situation. To return briefly to our metaphor of the controversial social media post that's about to turn into a dumpster fire, it's not like Jesus is turning off the comment section so much as he's forcing an intentional pause so that everyone, perhaps himself included, needs to take a 5-minute breather before returning to the conversation. Perhaps Jesus needed that pause himself. Perhaps he's using that silence to take some time to make sure that his response to the situation is a faithful, righteous, and gracious one that respects the dignity of all parties involved while still doing the right thing. Because that's a tough thing to do sometimes. Reminds me of a quote by Fred Rogers. I have my Fred Rogers figurine right here in the pulpit holding Daniel Tiger, and I think he's going to stay up here in the pulpit with me as a good reminder for me in the years to come. Fred Rogers once said this. He said, "Our society is much more interested in information than wonder, in noise than silence. And I feel that we need a lot more wonder and a lot more silence in our lives." So to Mr. Rogers' point, I don't think that we live in a society that rewards those of us who are silent or practice the spiritual discipline of intentional listening. Instead, we live in a society that rewards in various ways those who are the loudest voice in the room. And yes, I do note the irony that in this moment, I am, in fact, literally the loudest voice in this room. I get it. But because of that, those of us who are preachers would do well, and this is something I'm working on myself too. I'm not trying to say that I'm a saint, to listen just as much, if not more so, than we speak when we step down from these pulpits. And so the first thing that Jesus accomplishes by doodling in the sand is to invoke silence to interrupt the conflict and to establish some space for reflection. Now, the second thing that he accomplishes by kneeling down to doodle is this. My preaching professor, Anna Carter Florence, had a background in theater before she turned to homiletics, to preaching. So that really influenced the way that she taught me and my fellow students, seminary students, preaching. So if those of you who are familiar with theater, there's a practice known as blocking a scene, which is when fairly early on in the rehearsing process, all the actors gather and the director, and they work together to map out the action in the scene. Who goes where? Hey, you go over to this wall, pick up that glass and throw it that way, or whatever. So it's when you're learning the movements and the choreography of the scene. And my preaching professor taught us that if we bring that same practice to biblical texts, it really helps us get deep into the text and bring that text alive. So together, I want us to block out this scene. So I imagine Jesus standing in the middle, And I imagine the woman on the ground next to him. I like to imagine that she was probably thrown there by those religious leaders, throwing her to the ground. And then around them, all the way around them, are the masses that are all looking at Jesus and the woman, all the way around them. So at the beginning of the encounter, the beginning of the scene, if you will, who is the central focus point? Jesus, yeah. And the woman is down here. And now, when he does this, who is everyone looking at? They're looking at each other. Jesus very specifically takes himself out of the line of sight to force everybody to look at each other. You see, we don't need to know what he wrote in the sand, because if we just see what happens in that silence, it tells us all that we need to know. So if the first lesson we've learned is the value of silence and reflection in this divisive time of conflict, the second lesson is that Jesus wants us to spend less time casting stones and more time looking at each other, looking at ourselves, assessing ourselves, practicing holy curiosity for how we can be neighborly towards one another. So rather than make him be the center of attention, Jesus intentionally takes the focus away from him to center the onlookers on themselves, forcing them and us, we are onlookers to this text, to ask the following question: are we contributing to the neighborliness of our community, or are we acting in ways that diminish it? But the scribes and the Pharisees still force the issue. They are, I think, dumbfounded by Jesus' refusal to enter the comment section. Jesus straightens up and says the words that we've all heard so many times before: let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw the stone. And he does it again. He kneels down, and one by one, they all disappear. The dumpster fire that could have been never was. The point was made. Mercy was given, justice was done, and Jesus really didn't even have to speak that much or even raise his voice. So I want to leave us this day with a story that has stuck with me over the past several years. And I knew this was a story I wanted to tell on my first Sunday with you all. A friend and a former congregant of mine is a gifted journalist and writer named Tom Juneau. And a couple of decades ago, while living in New York City and writing for Esquire magazine, my friend Tom was called into his editor's office, who said, "Tom, I'm sending you to Pittsburgh tomorrow for a new assignment." Tom said, "Okay, who's in Pittsburgh that you want me to interview?" And his editor said, "Fred Rogers." And my friend Tom paused and said, "You mean Mr. Rogers, the children's show guy?" And his editor said, "That's the one. We're doing an edition on heroes, and I want you to write an article on Fred Rogers for our cover story." And so Tom flew to Pittsburgh and interviewed Mr. Rogers, and such began a close relationship between the two, enduring up until Fred died in 2003. If you've seen the movie A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, featuring Tom Hanks as Mr. Rogers, it turns out that story is based off of my friend's relationship with Mr. Rogers. He is that journalist. They change his name. The name of the movie they changed to Lloyd Vogel, but his real name is Tom Juneau. So fast forward, now the story continues, fast forward to 2020. That was a fun year, wasn't it? Remember that? The beginning of the pandemic, the horrible murder of George Floyd, and the eruption of the Black Lives Matter protests. We were all arguing about masks and COVID policies, and in the middle of all of that turmoil of it was the Trump administration and then the election between Trump and Joe Biden, and our country just seemed to be falling apart. And those of us, with the notable exception of any of you all who may have lived through the 60s, had never, many of us my age, we had never seen the country so divided, being ripped apart. So in the months leading up to the election, I called up Tom over Zoom. And I asked Tom, as I had many times before, about his friendship with Mr. Rogers. I told him that I knew I certainly wasn't the only person who grew up with Mr. Rogers who wondered what he'd have to say about the current events if he were still alive. And I then turned to Tom and I asked him a question that I now see as a rather foolish one. I asked Tom, I said, if Fred were still alive, how would he argue? And Tom paused. And he looked at me with a gentle smile through the computer screen, and he said to me a sentence that I will never forget. He said, Stephen, Fred didn't have to argue. He was the argument. And that has stuck with me ever since. As we begin our time together, I don't want us to argue. I want us to be the argument. I want us to be the argument for the kind of church that values neighborliness over and above all else and refuses to let the division so rampant in our country obscure and distract us from our focus on the gospel. I don't want us to argue. I want us to be the argument for the kind of community where we strive to practice the kind of forbearance that Jesus demonstrates in today's passage. The preacher, Nancy Taylor, wrote the following about today's passage, and I commend it to you. She says, the world eggs us on to judge others. It expects it of us, but the way of the Christian is different. The way of the Christian is the way of forbearance. And because the way of forbearance is countercultural and counterintuitive, it must be learned. She goes on to say, forbearance emanates from the one who in the face of pulsing temples, flaring nostrils, and veins as big as ropes, bends down, makes himself vulnerable, diverts the accuser's attention from the accused, and causes a pause in the action. Jesus gently invites and encourages us in living a life of humility and clear-eyed assessment of ourselves and our community. I don't want us to argue. I want us to be the argument for a kind of faith family where we teach our children that our commitment to justice must never allow ourselves to dehumanize the person with whom we disagree on how that's done. We must not devolve into shaming that person. Do we have any Brene Brown fans in the house? Fair warning, you're going to be hearing a lot of Brene from your new pastor in the months to come. But she once tweeted the following. She said, shame is not a moral compass or a social justice tool. It's a tool of oppression. In today's passage, the scribes and the Pharisees were weaponizing shame to dehumanize this woman, and Jesus refused to sink to that level in order to score some points in an argument. I don't want us to argue. I want us to be the argument for a kind of Christianity that isn't used to score political points or is manipulated in order to gain popularity or influence or affluence, three things that Jesus never seemed to care very much about. Instead, I want us to be the argument for the kind of Christianity that remains laser-focused on doing justice, loving kindness, and walking humbly. And of those three mandates, to do justice, and love kindness and walk humbly, we must never let our pursuit of the first to be done at the expense of the second and the third. And finally, I don't want us to argue. I want us to be the argument for the kind of world where the stranger, the immigrant, the refugee, the person on the other side of the aisle or the other side of the railroad tracks, where that person is seen first and foremost as a beloved child of God, worthy of kindness and dignity and respect no less than the rest of us. And friends, I also want to be perfectly clear about what being the argument instead of arguing does not mean. It doesn't mean that we will always remain neutral in all situations. Desmond Tutu once brilliantly said, if the elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality in the situation. It should be noted that although Jesus did de-escalate the situation in today's passage, he also took a side. He clearly sided with the woman and valued her well-being over and above those who were using her for their self-interest. I also want to be clear that being the argument instead of arguing does not mean that we can't have important discussions about issues that affect our community, our neighbors, our congregation, our individual faith journeys. This congregation already has a great history of having such important conversations as a way for us to grow together as disciples. And you and I are going to continue to build on that foundation, but we must do so in a way that upholds the dignity and values the humanity of the person with whom we differ. And finally, being the argument instead of arguing does not mean that we always avoid conflict of any sort. Jesus did flip tables and drive out animals with a whip, but it's also important to know, as best as I can tell, he pulled that card very rarely. And I think that's because he knew there was a time and a place for flipping tables, but also that time and place is not every time and every place, and that those times and places must be chosen carefully and used sparingly. I also want to be clear about one last thing. Your new pastor has doled out a lot of spiritual advice over the last 15 minutes. I do not stand before you as one who has mastered this art. Just ask my wife. You will see her hopefully next week. But I'm trying to do better. And I think you're here today too because you want to do better. Together, we are all works in progress, and the journey of Christian discipleship is a lifelong one with many twists and turns and ups and downs and infinite opportunities for growth. Thanks be to God. So my dear, beloved, new neighbors, let's let some stones fall from our fingers and let's be the argument. In the name of God, the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, may all of us, God's beloved children, say, Amen. Amen.